So our recording is now in session. So once again, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Julie Pascaret. Over to you, Julie.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, James, for the nice introduction. Indeed, I'm working at the European Network Against Racism, trying to do our best to organize and contribute to organize the anti-racism movement and influence policies and legislation at the EU level. So I will share my screen. So what I wanted to discuss today is really about the impact of 2020 on the anti-racism movement, especially on how structural racism is being addressed, and how Islamophobia is actually having an impact on all of this work. So following the murder of George Floyd and the massive Black Lives Matter protesting in Europe, there has been an increased recognition of structural racism. And I will show how also it had an impact also on the understanding on racism when it comes to its institutional and structural forms. On the other hand, for INAI, we have never seen such violent attacks against civil society, against the understanding of racism, the understanding of intersectionality in different member states. And I want to show that actually the widespread and unchallenged anti-Muslim narrative in Europe is not helping to actually really tackle structural racism. And on the contrary, it's actually preventing from addressing deeply embedded structural racism. And I will highlight that actually doesn't have an impact only on Muslims, but also on racialized groups in general. And I also, since I'm also an advocate and trying always to look at solutions, I also try to provide some ways forward. So first I wanted to kind of set the context and clarify what we are talking about. So we are working against racism. We are working against the process of racialization that is leading to exclusion of certain groups in society. So we understand racialization as the process of ascribing characteristics and attributes that are presented as innate to a group of concern to it, and of constructing false social hierarchies in racial terms and associated exclusion and hostility. This is taken from the newly adopted opinion of the Council of Europe, ECRI, which is the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, which is a very important body in the Council of Europe to kind of raise awareness to member states about racism and intolerance in their countries, but also to issue recommendations and policy position on the issue. And this has been a very bold move from them to actually adopt this opinion, which I really encourage you to read and to disseminate. Especially they decided to adopt this opinion following all the review they have done on their recommendation on anti-Muslim racism. So they really saw the need to actually clarify what race and racialization mean because of the work they had done on anti-Muslim racism. And also just to clarify as well that when we talk about when you talk about racialization, different characteristics can enter into play to actually racialize people. So not only skin color, not only ethnicity, but also migrant background, but also religion, language, nationality. So all these characteristics can be used as a way to racialize people. Also to kind of define what we mean by structural racism and structural discrimination. It describes the statistical representation of discrimination through the aggregation, through the aggregation of individual cases and of discrimination. So this is really like looking at how racism and racial discrimination is actually represent, and it's actually having an impact on the whole society and how the proportion of it in society. So this is taken from the report of INA on intersectional discrimination. When it comes to institutional racism, it describes discrimination patterns originated by institutions and laws. It focuses on input on the action, behaviors, decisions of people in positions of power within institutions. So it's very similar to structural racism, but it's really focusing on where it comes from, where this systemic discrimination comes from specifically. And we will see that actually when it comes from places of power, it has, of course, an even bigger impact on the lives of people and on society as a whole. And finally, I wanted to finish by describing what we mean by Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, because we understand Islamophobia as a form of racism. So I've taken this definition from the European Islamophobia report. Islamophobia is about a dominant group of people aiming at seizing, stabilizing, and widening their power by means of defining a scapegoat, real or invented, and excluding the scapegoat from the resources rights definition of a constructed we. Islamophobia operates by constructing a static Muslim identity which is attributed in negative terms and generalized for all Muslims. And I will add to that even people that are perceived as Muslims, but who don't necessarily identify as Muslims and who don't necessarily are even from Muslim background. So this is also very important to mention. So after just this setting this context when it comes to definition, since INA is really working at the EU level, I wanted also to kind of present what's being done at the EU level to combat structural racism in general, and then go to the impact of Islamophobia on this work. So the European Union has actually a strong competence on non-discrimination and fundamental rights, including on racial discrimination. It has a binding power, meaning that it has legislation that member states need to transpose in their own national legislations. So it's one of the biggest international institutions. It's one of the most powerful international institutions when it comes to binding power and legislative power. There has been the adoption of the Equality Directives against racial discrimination in 2000. However, these directives have also left a lot of gaps in protection. For example, these equality directives are not covering all the actions by law enforcement. So racism in law enforcement is not actually covered, and this is actually what is being discussed at the moment, especially after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. There is also a gap in protection when it comes to religious minorities, because religious minorities are only covered in the field of employment, but not in other fields, like it's the case for racial discrimination. So this we will be also discussing a bit more in detail. Another milestone in the recognition of structural racism is the 2015 colloquium of the European Commission on Antisemitism and Islamophobia. And it was very important to have this meeting in the sense that it was the first recognition of the issue of Islamophobia at the EU level. So of course, anti-Semitism has been much more recognized at EU level for a long time, even though it might not have led to really concrete measures, but there was this political recognition. But for the first time, there was this recognition of Islamophobia. And then following this colloquium, there was the appointment of the European Commission's coordinators on anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. So very also important and symbolic announcement that the Commission was really like embedded these two forms of racism as priorities in its work. In the EU structure, there is also the Fundamental Rights Agency, which mandate is to actually produce research reports and issue recommendations to actually ensure that fundamental rights are respected in Europe. And they have done landmark reports on racialized groups, including on the Roma, on Black people, on Muslims, on Jews, etc. So they have there is a lot of actually of data that is available to actually show that the situation of racialized groups is still very dire in Europe nowadays. And then the very important turning point for the anti-racism movement in Europe has been 2020, of course. I mentioned it already. And as a response to all these street protests and grassroots movement protests, the European Union decided to adopt a European Union action plan against racism, which provides the European Union with a framework to actually act against racism. And it's including a lot of different elements when it comes to legislation, improvement of legislation, racial equality mainstreaming in all policies, internal diversity in the EU institution, etc. So it's really like comprehensive. And the very important element that is in this action plan is that it's the first time that there is an acknowledgement of structural and institutional forms of racism. And so far, there was an understanding of racism at the EU level, which was really individualized and based on the individual incidents, in-person incidents of racism. So I have put the quote from the EU Action Plan, which is racist and discriminatory behavior can be embedded in social, financial, and political institutions, impacting on the levels of power and on policy making. This structural racism perpetuates the barriers placed in the way of citizens solely due to their racial or ethnic origin. So this is really like an important document for us on which we really built our work, including the work on Islamophobia. So I just wanted, before I go to really Islamophobia, I just wanted to highlight some of the challenges already, because you will see that they are quite connected also to the struggles to the struggle to make recognized Islamophobia. So first, the understanding of race and racialization, even though it has evolved, there is still an understanding that race is linked to ethnicity or skin color, but not that it can be actually like that people can be racialized based on other characteristics, as I was mentioning. And this is also illustrated by some countries trying to remove race from their constitutions, for example, which is not something we actually support, because it will have an impact on how we can implement racial legislation against racial discrimination. There is also, as I was mentioning, even though there is now this EU action plan recognizing the institutional forms and structural forms, there is still another focus on individual approach to racism. This is still there, and this is very difficult to actually counter, because also the legislation in place are really like addressed to individual acts of discrimination. This is also illustrated by the huge focus of the European Commission on hate speech, hate crime, which is of course a very important area of work, because it's one of the most extreme form of racism. But at the same time, if we look at hate crime, hate speech without looking at it as one of the symptoms of structural racism, and without trying to lift the barriers also for racialized groups to actually be included in society, then there will be it won't lead to a lot of success. Another key challenge is the lack of equality data disaggregated by race. So this is especially in most countries in Europe, you cannot collect this kind of data, which makes it very difficult to get a picture of the reality of racism, but also like to have informed policies and legislation on the different issues that would have been revealed by this data. Another challenge is also the lack of intersectional approach. We have worked a lot also on raising awareness about these concepts, about the need to actually have a transversal approach to inequalities and look at how different kinds of oppressions are interconnected. But this has been very difficult Also because different policies that are in place are sometimes detrimental to other groups. So there is still not an intersectional approach to reviewing policies, to implementing policies that would be necessary to actually have a real equality. Even though institutional racism is recognized in the EU Action Plan, it's still not addressed in practice. For example, where we know where institutional racism is the most prevalent is in the migration policy, in the law enforcement, in the security and counterterrorism policy, but these policies are still not questioned. And these policies are still, there are still no real measures to ensure that they are not leading to racism. For example, racial profiling is still something that is seen as not, of course, this is profiling is a practice that is being still justified. Although we as anti-racist advocate, we say that most profiling practices are actually impacted racialized people, so they should be forbidden. And another key challenge, which is also important, is the shrinking space of civil society in general in Europe. So the lack of participation, of involvement of civil society, the lack of funding, and also the increasing attacks against civil society. But I will come back to that. So I wanted to connect these contexts on structural racism, these challenges that we have, with the denial of Islamophobia that exists at the European Union level. And actually, we thought that with this EU Action Plan against racism, there would be a kind of an improvement of the understanding of Islamophobia as a form of racism, but we see that there are still a lot of challenges, and this is having an impact on the general challenges that I have mentioned. So the concept of racialization and intersectionality are being questioned in light of Islamophobia, meaning that, for example, in France, there has been some controversies in the feminist movement on what is intersectionality, and the fact that intersectionality was being used to support the rights of Muslim women. So this has been often questioned especially in the case of Muslims. Same for racialization and the fact that Muslims are not a race. Belonging to Islam is not a race. Is a question of religion. So there has been really this misunderstanding based on the case of Muslims. A lot of controversy over the terminology Islamophobia, which in many cases has been done to divert actually the discussion from the structural phenomenon. So we were not discussing the definition of what we understand as Islamophobia, as anti-Muslim racism, but really like only focusing on this terminology as a way to deny the overall phenomenon. And again, this has been done a lot in France, but it's having an impact on other EU countries as well. The criminalization and other policies in the context of counterterrorism and counter-radicalization are heavily racialized and unquestioned because of powerful anti-Muslim narrative. And this is really something that we have seen and we have researched as well. We have released a report on that last year, where we actually see that there is the anti-Muslim narrative portraying Muslims as the potential terrorists, as the problems that we need to solve in Europe, has actually helped to justify over-criminalization, over-policing of Muslims or people perceived as Muslims, such as Arab people, in the name of security and of counterterrorism. And this is very difficult to question, even politically, because of this strong narrative that is there and such embedded in the mentalities, in the mindsets of decision makers, And so that's why it's very difficult to actually question. Another key obstacle that is showing also the denial of Islamophobia is how conspiracy theories around civil society have been developing and largely left unchallenged as well. So we have seen in the past few years an increasing level of attacks, even from the governments, and of labeling of civil society organizations as belonging to to political Islam, and with no evidence, with no ground, but leading to criminalization or leading to infringement of rights without really strong condemnation, without really strong condemnation, especially from decision makers. And finally, when it comes to gendered Islamophobia and how actually Islamophobia is also impacting a lot Muslim women, and how the neutrality concept in the different areas of life has been used to actually exclude women, Muslim women, from an increasing number of places in their lives. So employment has been the first one. The schools education system has been one of the first one. Employment is also another one, which is much more like spread across Europe. But they are now also, we are talking about public spaces. I mean, this, and all in the name of neutrality, of laicity as well. This is really like mixed and used and misunderstood as only as a way to exclude Muslim women. So now I will show that these different challenges actually are having an impact on fundamental rights and the rule of law in Europe. So also meaning that it's not only impacting Muslims first, not only impacting racialized groups, but in the end impacting the whole European societies. So the first, all these narratives, all these different challenges and this denial of Islamophobia are actually leading to harsh migration policies for racialized people in general. Because the anti-Muslim narrative have been used by many policymakers, decision makers in Europe to justify Fortress Europe, to justify the strengthening of border management controls and the violence there, and the violent pushback against migrants. And you might have heard also related to the Ukraine crisis, how some politicians have used the fact that they were non-Muslims so that we could accept them, that they had the same religion, etc. So we really see that this anti-Muslim narrative that is left unchallenged is actually justifying also harsher migration policies. The expansion of pre-crime as well. So I was talking about counterterrorism, I was talking about counter-radicalization, and we have seen actually when researching about the expansion of counterterrorism policies, we have seen that actually there has been an expansion of the scope of criminal law to include action that don't lead to act of terrorism. And we have seen that actually in criminalizing actions that do not involve direct harm to others, prosecutions place increased reliance on the implied dangerousness of an individual to link their non-harmful actions to the potential for terrorism in the future. And the evidence of dangerousness can involve invoking racialized stereotypes and tropes that link Islam and Muslims to violence. So there has been really this expansion of criminalizing non-harmful actions, relying really on this anti-Muslim narrative of potential terrorists. And this we have seen that also in the counter-radicalization approach, where actually people that are being surveilled according to radicalization indicators that are most of the case religious practices and religious indicators. The expansion of police power, so it's also related to this expansion of counterterrorism, this expansion of pre-crime, of criminal law, and the justified by this big threat that can be the Islamic terrorism. I mean, over infringements of fundamental rights such as freedom of expression, of religion and belief, of association. So of religion and belief, we've talked about Muslim women wearing the headscarf. So we now hearing like calls to actually forbid it in the public spaces. We hear also these kind of practices at the workplace that is allowing employers to prevent Muslim women wearing the headscarf from getting jobs, public-facing jobs, for example. So there is really this impact on religion and belief, and not only on Muslim women, because all of this having an impact in order to keep, like, to kind of justify in society also the neutrality of the measures. These are also having these kind of measures these kind of measures targeting initially Muslims are actually impacting all over religious minorities, such as Jewish people wearing the kippas or Sikh wearing the turban. And of associations, so we have seen that also recently in different member states, including in Austria and France. There has been increasing measures against associations, for example, associations receiving funds from abroad, or like the law on separatism in France, who are asking associations to sign a charter and limiting their freedom of association. And just like in general, these different measures, these different practices are actually undermining equality in general for all. And because this ideology, which is producing hierarchy, is actually being used to infringe fundamental rights, but is actually also being justified in society. And then, as I was saying, undermining fundamental rights, undermining equality for all. It's, as I always say, it's a kind of entry door to actually infringe fundamental rights for all. And we see that, for example, the law on separatism is not having an impact only on Muslims, it's having an impact on other movements that are trying to fight for different causes. For example, recently there has been the dissolution, or at least the project to dissolve an anti-fascist organization. So it's really having based on this law on separatism, so it's really having a huge impact on society. So yeah, just to kind of sum up what I was saying, anti-Muslim narrative is being used to demonize racialized people perceived as Muslims as the embodiment of the other, and contribute to the erosion of fundamental rights for all. So I just wanted to finish with a kind of positive note before I leave you the floor, because of course we want to be hopeful, and we want to try to think of ways to counter these very worrying trends. And as a social movement, we have ideas, and we actually quite supported by a big movement. So first, generally, it's very important to raise awareness about the concept of race and racialization, what we mean by that, how it is constructed socially, and on which characteristics, and how it's how it's taking place. This is really like one way to, and also on the concept of intersectionality, this is also really a way to show how groups are actually impacted by inequalities, and how Muslims as well, or people perceived as Muslim, are actually also victims of that. The importance to address conspiracy theories, because for the moment, it's as I was saying, it's left unaddressed, and it's very difficult for civil society to actually defend themselves in the silence that exists, because even like progressive politicians, they fear to actually support civil society victims of these conspiracy theories, because it's so costly and so sensitive. But there is a need really to think about strategies to address this, to show that these are really conspiracy theories that are trying to link civil society organizations that are organizing around their Muslim identity or around the fight against Islamophobia, that are directly like being demonized. So there is really a need to debunk that and to deconstruct that. Building post-narratives. So this is a bit related to what I was just saying. So narratives around Muslims in Europe, around racialized groups in Europe, and debunking and trying to propose something new that is much more positive. Building wider intersectional coalition on equality and justice. So this is also key. We need to broaden the coalitions. We need to ensure that we work with different marginalized groups to show that there are really interconnection between inequalities, between oppressions. And recently we have increased also our coalitions with human rights organizations, which are taking a lot of, increasingly taking an anti-racist approach in their work. And it's really like the way we will actually advance on this, because of course the power of the movement is having a big impact on all these narratives. And finally, the need to mainstream racial justice in policies and legislation, including in human rights work. This is really something that is also very important to do, to be able to assess, review policies in light of racial justice, and to see to what extent they're actually contributing or not to racism. So I'm done with this presentation. I hope it was interesting, and I'm of course looking forward to further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julie. Fabulous. There's a lot for us to think about. Can I encourage everyone to please put your questions for Julie in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of the screen. Just to say, I've received a message in the chat asking about this session, whether it will be on YouTube. It will be. So we're recording at the moment, and it will be going up on the Monitor Racism YouTube channel. So lots for us to think about. We have a couple of questions already in the Q&A box at the bottom. I have here two questions. The first is there a difference between European nations which are, say, Catholic dominant, non-religious dominant, and or Protestant? Also European countries where Islam is a dominant religion? And number two, what do you think about prevent schemes run in the UK? Well, I imagine number two could probably go on to speak all day on that one. Well, number one as well. But thank you very much. So this is a question from one of the PhD student members of the International Centre on Racism, Elena Gigino.
So on the first question, is there a difference between prevention and chance? It's difficult to say, but I think when it comes to, for example, a prohibition of, I think it depends on different levels, or what different levels of where Islamophobia is manifesting itself. Especially as in the recent years, Islamophobic narrative, anti-Muslim narrative are really focused on counterterrorism. And this has been really the big change, even when it comes to, for example, the prohibition of headscarves in different areas of life. Before, there was the arguments that were more used that were gender equality, neutrality, as I was mentioning. But now neutrality is much more linked with counterterrorism, with the fear of Islamism, etc. But maybe before, like for example, prohibition of headscarves was much less a problem in more religious countries. and more a problem in laicite country, like in France, for example. That's really where things started to happen. But now, since it's becoming more a security issue, I'm not sure it's really like, I would not be able to say in details, of course, but I'm not sure there is really a difference from one country to the other, especially when taking this security narrative. But then, you know, I think it can be different, but then it's more like when it comes to really details, I would not be able to say in more detail. What do you think about prevent schemes run in the UK? So from what I've heard, I have not studied prevent like in detail as well, but knowing from the anti-racism movement there as well, it was also heavily racialized, heavily focusing on the Muslim communities, and also heavily relying on racialization. So this is really something that has been also quite put into question, and opposed by civil society. So I see there is another question, so maybe I can take it.
Before we get to that question, I wonder if I could just take advantage of my position as the chair to ask my own question. I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one is, I just wondered if you could speak to us, Julie, about the practical steps that you're already taking in the network and as a senior advocacy officer to try to do some of this, because I think that's really what's missing from a lot of public discussions. And certainly myself as an academic, it's really helpful to hear some very specific practical steps that can be taken. So that's my first question. If you could speak to that, please.
Yes, of course. This is really what I like to discuss about also when it comes to practical steps, because this is really about the jobs we are doing. So, I mean, the kind of strategy that I mentioned at the end is really in line with what we are trying to do already. So one thing that we have tried to do is first using this EU Anti-Racism Action Plan and mobilizing the diversity of civil society around its implementation, including organizations working on Islamophobia, so really ensuring that they participate and that they raise their issues as well within this framework. One specific also priority that we have is to question also counterterrorism policies and show how deeply racialized and how they are actually increasing racism in society. So what we have actually issued a report last year, as I was mentioning, exactly mentioning that how these policies have been developed based on Islamophobia, based on anti-Muslim racism, and how this should be actually questioned and reviewed. So this is more a work on specific policies. When it comes also to civil society building and post narratives, we are also trying to work with our members that are being attacked by this kind of conspiracy theories to develop some narratives to kind of debunk directly when it's coming out in the media, when it's being used by politicians. We are really trying to work on these counter narratives. I think in the case of Islamophobia, there is a lot to be done on narratives, public narratives, and also getting politicians to be bolder in denouncing what's happening in society. And for example, the question, I mean, what's happening in France at the moment with the French election, where you have some candidates always targeting Muslims and also migrants without any condemnation, without any answer like counter narrative, etc. is really where we should work, because that's all this narrative that is public, that is being held by high-level people, like influential people, is actually then justifying policies, justifying practices. So we really need to work also on the narrative and the denunciation of narrative. So for that, we need to equip our civil society. We need to equip progressive politicians to be able to talk and to denounce that as well. So, and this is what we are doing at the moment. And when it comes to coalitions, we are already like building a lot of coalitions with, as I was saying, with Amnesty International, with Human Rights Watch, with all different groups as well, because what we are trying to see is also to kind of build a solidarity front across racialized groups. Because what this kind of discourses has been doing is also dividing groups among, instead of uniting them against structural racism. We all have this common oppression in common. We are all impacted by this common oppression, so we should really be working together against structural racism. So we are trying also to show that there are common manifestations, common mechanisms of racialization to ensure that we can go together against that.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question before I move on to the questions in the Q&A box, which is that in my own experience of sitting in a room with policymakers, I find it very difficult to try to get beyond these very established frameworks of thinking about Islam and about Muslims. And that is to say that structural Islamophobia and racisms in general are so powerful that I can end up essentially having a very, just a separate conversation. I'm speaking, a politician or an official is speaking, but we just inhabit different intellectual universes. And I picked up something you said there about working with progressive politicians. So is that your method, your methodology for dealing with this, to try and bring on board politicians and officials who you've already identified who are more sympathetic?
Yes, definitely. That's what we are doing, at least at EU level, with members of the European Parliament, with people in the European Commission, with also some representatives of member states that are much more progressive on anti-racism, to actually support this work. And for us, this is really an opportunity. This EU Anti-Racism Action Plan is very an opportunity to also approach racism in its comprehensive way. So also like stopping this siloed approach on different groups, but really understanding racism in its comprehensive way and looking at all groups affected by racism. This is really a way also to make people understand that, you know, there is nothing specific about Muslims or very specific sensitive about Muslims. They're also impacted by racism and they need to understand that. And what you were saying about the sensitivity of the issue and also the difficulty to debunk that, I think there are two maybe also strategies. First is to increase participation of Muslim people in places, in decision-making structures. This is also a very important aspect of our work. We really work on participation, on representation in institutions, in policy making. So like creating participatory mechanisms in different structures of society where you ensure that you have a diversity of racialized people, including Muslims. So this is really important because then Muslims themselves, they can also bring this perspective and they can also champion the issue. Not only them, but at least that they can be one of the supporters. And another strategy is also the support for the broader, like kind of trying to show how this is actually having an impact on society as a whole, and not just on racialized groups, not just on Muslims, but on a real rule of law, on fundamental rights. That yes, today it will be against Muslims or Roma or Black people, but tomorrow it will be against the whole society. And we are already seeing that. I mean, you already have reports on rule of law, on human rights that are showing, democracy that are showing that all of these different measures or legislation have an impact generally on the general issue, on the general structures.
Thank you very much indeed, Julie. So we do have an additional question, and we do have a bit of more time. I think that we can squeeze in some more questions. So please do get your questions and comments into the Q&A box. There's a question here about the issue in France, so-called Islamo-gauchism. How is this affecting the academic field in France, and how does this in turn affect studies in France on the Arab and Muslim world?
I mean, I'm not an expert on that. So yeah, I mean, I just know that this has been indeed a label that has been used. And this is also where you see that actually it's not only in targeting Muslims, but also non-Muslims and supporters of Muslims. And I'm not even supporters, like just supporters of equality, like people that try to denounce the inequalities that are so blatant for people that don't construct Muslims as problems. This has been this labeling has been used against academics, yes, against politicians, against against activists that are non-Muslim, etc. So this has been having a lot of impact on trying to demonize this kind of people. I mean, when it comes to the academic field itself, I cannot tell you in detail, and in the Arab and Muslim world, I cannot tell you in detail. But what I know generally, that there has been an increasing, it has created a chilling effect, at least in other parts. I know in other parts of society, like in institutions, it has created a chilling effect, a kind of self-censorship when it comes to denouncing inequalities targeting Muslims. So this is definitely something that is working, at least in France, at least sometimes in the European institutions, and that's also why we have difficulty to get high-level, high-profile people to talk about what's happening to Muslims, because they will be directly, labeled as Islamo-gauchism or Islamo supporters, etc. And this is this will be really costly also for them politically.
Thank you very much. And we do have a comment, a member of the audience, Sarah Tonzi, who said academics who are working on the Muslim world are targeted. Yes, you're right. Thank you. On that note, I think that connects with the particular climate across Europe, but you kept coming back to the issue of France. And I wonder, we had another comment from a member of the audience who would like to ask you if you could please say something about the current elections and how you think this has impacted upon or will impact upon Islamophobia. So
I'm not living in France, but I have, of course, as a French person, I have followed it, and also as INAR, we have followed it quite closely. So France has been also at the forefront of spreading Islamophobia, if I can say it like that. I mean, at least they're at the highest institutional level, in the way they have stigmatized, in the way they have targeted Muslims, even though they were not using the word Muslims, but using labels, generalizing, and in practice targeting the whole Muslim communities. The campaign of some candidate has been all over security, again, like protecting France from Muslims, from migrants, and all over security. And in the face of that, there has been some also awareness from some constituencies, including the suburbs, what they call quartier populaire des banlieues, but I don't like this word, but the suburbs, I think I will translate this way, popular neighborhood with also majority of Muslims, that some of them have also like been much more aware of the need to get involved. Because what we see now is that there is really high potential for the far right to be elected. Why? Because last election, Macron was actually seen as the one who could oppose the ideas of the far right, oppose the political project of the far right based on Islamophobia and racism. But throughout his mandate, he has shown actually that he has not been this person. He has not been this government. Actually, he has ministers who have actually pushed for laws, pushed for discourses against Muslims, against and criminalizing Muslims increasingly and infringing rights of Muslims. So now it's not so obvious for people to think that if Macron and Le Pen are in the second round, they will vote for Macron. How? Because it becomes very difficult for them to say we will vote for someone who has contributed to our oppression for the past 5 years. It's becoming very difficult then to do that. So to my perspective, there are two camps. So there are people who really think that it's very complicated. There is no obvious opposition to the anti-racist, to the racist narrative and policies, because most candidates, and especially the ones that are likely to win, are racist. So there is no perfect solution. And then there is also others that think that they should engage much more. And for example, you have a coalition of activists from the popular neighborhood who have for the first time called to vote for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which is another candidate, which is, even though, he's not perfect, a lot of he has been, of course, criticized for past speeches, etc. But a lot of, he is one of the only one who has refused to use this security approach in his discourse, who has even denounced this stigmatization of Muslims in the campaign. And for example, the government of Macron, they have said nothing about this narrative. And to be honest, I have watched several debates and it's very violent. And I cannot understand that in a country like France, there cannot be any denunciation, any public denunciation against what we are hearing on the TV. So it's kind of very, very violent. I've never heard this kind of things. I don't even understand why it's not actually condemned, even like legal on the court. So so there are some actors that have decided to call for the first time, to call for one of the candidates who have defended in his discourse, in his recent discourses, Muslims, and refuse to go into this security migration narrative.
Thank you very much, Julie. And I myself, I've written on Islamophobia and surveillance, and I don't think it augured very well when Macron, when he became president, instead of using a Citroën to arrive down the Champs-Élysées to become inaugurated president, he used a military vehicle, and which he stood up as if he was surveying, the landscape there to keep French people, quote unquote, safe. I'd just like to bring in connection with this issue and what was mentioned before, one of our members of our audience, Sarah Tonzi, who's an expert on Egypt and who works in France. And I just wondered if Sarah could just speak a little bit in response to this issue of people being targeted if they do speak out against Islamophobia.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you for letting me join in with some comments. Actually, I think that after Macron's discourse on separatism, after the murder of the high school teacher. This was what really increased the sort of hate speech against or the Islamogauchism that was being referred to in the media by academics, by even notable researchers who belong to the CNRS, the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique. They became all of a sudden separatist in a sort of way, talking about Islamogauchism and referring to anyone who's covering the Arab and Muslim world as belonging to this sort of phantom of Islamogauchist that who are allegedly are not being objective in their research and are supporting the scary phantom that they're referring to, whatever that is. I had some colleagues who were actually accused of being Islamo-gauchist, and I believe that they mainly ignored the accusations because there was nothing to do about it. There was no room for debate. It was highly mediatized, like you said. They're hegemonizing or monopolizing the media. And I think that they're sort of winning the narrative, if we may say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think perhaps if we could just conclude then, Julie, with a very difficult question that connects to what Sarah was just saying, which is, in this kind of context, what can anti-racists actually do that has an impact? How can we contribute to improving the situation in France, for example, but not just there, in other parts of Europe and the UK? What works?
That's a very difficult question indeed, because I think if we knew, then we would have done it. I think we are trying to solve a very complex issue, so we don't have the perfect solutions. There are different strategies. But I think at the moment, in the short term, what I see very important is first understanding racism as connected to other kind of oppression. So really like trying to have this analysis of what's happening with an intersectional approach, looking at racism, capitalism, patriarchy, like all of this is interconnected. And then it will also, and I think what we also need, and linked to that understanding, what we also need is united front, is a united front based on this understanding that we cannot stay silent and we cannot not unite when all of these things are happening. So, and this can be in different ways. This can be via communicating together, like having joint statement, having trying to build more alliances. I think we need more alliances. We need, because there has been an isolation of some organizations working on this issue, and the only way to build our power and to have more influence on what's going on is to kind of unite and see that it's also one of the key issues at the moment of Europe that is connected to a lot of issues, but can have a huge impact on the lives of people at the moment. So not the perfect solution, but at least like, so some ways forward.
Thank you so much, Julie. And another comment from the audience in the chat from Sarah again. Yes, definitely an intersectionality and solidarity between all those working against these racisms and this oppression. Also, I would just add to everybody for your information that we're really thrilled at the International Centre on Racism and at Monitor Racism magazine that Julie will be one of the keynote speakers at our conference on this very issue, which will be in May, called Witch Hunts, Race and the Persecution of Women from Antiquity to the 21st Century. I'd like to thank you again, Julie, for this contribution. And we shall now hand over to our next speaker, Dr. Scarlett Harris.
Hi, everybody. Am I okay to?
And I would just,
James?
yeah, please do upload your slides while I introduce you. Really thrilled that Dr. Harris could join us. Dr. Harris is an ESRC postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology at the University of Manchester. She researches and writes on state racism, anti-racism, and left politics. Dr. Harris recently co-authored a report published by the Institute of Race Relations, exploring police racism in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and is currently writing a book based on her doctoral research for Manchester University Press, entitled Islamophobia, Antiracism, and the British Left. And Dr. Harris is going to be zooming in on a particular area where we can talk about combating Islamophobia, and this is the question of policing, in which she is a leading expert. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Harris. Over to you.
Thank you very much, James, for that introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay and can see my slides okay. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much to Julie as well for offering a really interesting perspective from elsewhere in Europe, and I think there are some really interesting dovetails with what Julie spoke about and what I'm hoping to talk about today. So just to give you a bit of a sense of where I'm coming from with my talk today, and that's that this is really an extension of my doctoral research, which explored the relationship between Islamophobia and anti-racist work in Britain. And today I want to sort of think a bit more about how the events of the last 2 to 3 years, so the years since I completed my PhD, have shaped and are shaping anti-racism in Britain in particular. So anti-racism in Britain is my main kind of intellectual and political preoccupation, and so Britain is the main focus of my talk today, but I will be speaking a bit to the US context and a little bit about Palestine at the very end as well. So one of the most significant developments to my mind in anti-racism in recent years has been a kind of abolitionist turn. We might call it an abolitionist turn. I think that's quite a useful phrase. In other words, an increasing focus on or a return to the issue of state violence, in particular the police and the wider criminal justice system. And I see this as being part of what Gargi Bhattacharya and other colleagues describe as the resurgence of a more expansive street politics. More multiple, more promiscuous, Gargi says. And I think we've seen this play out in the movement around Jeremy Corbyn, also known as Corbynism, the kind of more recent waves of the Black Lives Matter movement, which saw some of the biggest anti-racist mobilizations in history, really quite extraordinary in that way. And also the protests in the last year and a bit in the UK against the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which is a movement that's calling itself Kill the Bill movement. I'm sure many of you are aware of this context, but I just want to set the scene a little bit for anyone who doesn't know. So within this political context, we could say vocabularies of police abolition have moved or seem to have moved from the margins and more into the mainstream. An obvious example of that would be this phrase of defund the police, which we heard in a lot of the Black Lives Matter marches. And there's a photo of someone in, I think that's the march in London, holding that sign there, the defund the police sign. At the same time, state Islamophobia in Britain has continued unabated. It's intensified, arguably. And we've already heard a little bit today about prevent as an issue. And so I won't sort of go into too much detail about prevent, but for those who are less familiar with the British context, it's the name given to the British government's sort of flagship counter-extremism policy, so-called counter-extremism. When I use the word extremism, I always put it in inverted commas or scare quotes. And it was launched in 2007 under New Labour, and it's kind of been expanded under subsequent governments ever since. And the essential idea of Prevent is really to, I mean, it embeds surveillance across key institutions, including education, including the health system, social care, and prisons as well. And it encourages those who work in those institutions to spot apparent signs of radicalization. So often Prevent is described as working in this pre-criminal space, or in a pre-criminal way, in terms of its focus on the potentiality for radicalization. I mean, kind of goes without saying really that we know that Prevent disproportionately impacts Muslim communities, despite all the tweaks that it's been subject to over the years, including the attempt to sort of widen the net of those it targets. So recently, there's been the inclusion of so-called far-right extremism into the Prevent agenda in an attempt by those responsible for Prevent to, in my eyes, to make it seem fairer than it is. Even so, even accounting for these tweaks, we still see that, you know, in 2017-18, 44% of referrals were for so-called Islamist extremism, and yet Muslims make up only 5.7% of the population. So I think it's important to point out the intentionality of Prevent as a policy. So it's not just that this is a poorly designed policy that you know, unfortunately happens to have a disproportionate impact on Muslim communities, but it's actually designed to target Muslim communities. And the best example, I think, one of the best illustrations of this, I think, is this figure here that I always come back to. It's from Aaron Kudnani's report in 2009 for the Institute of Race Relations. And I mean, you can clearly see here the ways in which the initial Prevent funding was distributed according to the areas in Britain with the highest population of Muslims, essentially. I mean, it's extremely stark from these figures. And this approach, this policy of distribution, experts believe continues today in terms of the allocation of Prevent resources, but it's been made much more opaque. So it's not quite as obvious as this or it's not as easy to get the numbers now in terms of how Prevent is allocated. So that's Prevent. I'm happy to talk a bit more about that in the discussion. I want to return now to the question of police abolition, or police and prison abolition, and just want to speak a little bit more about it as a sort of conceptual framework. And I'd say that the current anti-racist turn towards police abolition has its roots in prison abolitionists and the work of prison abolitionists in the US, who were and are interested in critically analysing the centrality of the prison to contemporary capitalism, and ultimately challenging society's reliance on prisons and carcerality more broadly. So I love this quote from Angela Davis, who is, I'm sure many people know, is one of the most prolific prison abolitionists. And Angela Davis says, "The prison has become a black hole into which the detritus of contemporary capitalism is deposited." She also explains how prison abolitionists in the US built on Du Bois's, and that's W.E.B. Du Bois, Du Bois's notion of the abolition of slavery, in which he conceived of abolition as not just an end to slavery, but the building of something new. So building of new institutions that would promote the inclusion of people into society in a real and enduring way. And Davis describes this as the struggle for an abolitionist democracy. So I want us to kind of keep in mind that idea of abolition as not just dismantling, but as rebuilding. I think that comes through as well in this quite useful summary from Adam Elliott Cooper, who says that prison abolitionists show how we can reorganize society to erode the power of police and prisons and empower community-led organizations which can provide safety and harm reduction in ways that don't rely on state violence. And I think we see this sort of approach, this rebuilding or attempt to rebuild in communities in a lot of the abolitionist anti-racist work happening on the ground in Britain at the moment, and I'm sure elsewhere. And I'd be really interested in talking a bit about some of those examples of the work happening on the ground if we get a chance to at the end of this. I'd also love to hear about other people's insights into abolitionist work happening in other settings. Okay, so what's been the focus of abolitionist thinking and organising in recent years? We've already talked a bit about the prison industrial complex in the US and the interest of American or North American prison abolitionists in that. Activists in Britain are increasingly approaching the education system through an abolitionist lens, and in particular focusing on what gets called the school to prison pipeline. There's also the idea of defunding the police, which has been around a while, but sort of became popularized in the most recent Black Lives Matter protests. And there's also the idea of border abolition, which a number of activists and scholars in the UK have spoken to. Having said all that, the issue of state Islamophobia, I believe, appears or seems to me to appear much less frequently in these discussions of police and prison abolition. And I'll get on to why I think that's the case, or why I think it might be the case. But for now, I just want to point out where I have seen it intersect with abolitionist discussions. So where it does exist in these discussions, I think tends to be in conversations around the connections between the policing of so-called terrorists and so-called gangs, including the historical forms of counterinsurgency policing. And again, Adam Elliott Cooper discusses those connections really well. And also in the, I suppose, situating of Muslims and other racially minoritized groups as, or the imagining of them as contemporary threats to the nation, and therefore the sorts of similar forms of criminalization and securitization that differently racialized groups are subject to. Okay, so having said that, this isn't to say, of course, that resistance to state Islamophobia hasn't been happening. It absolutely has. But what I'm trying to do here is identify a bit of a disconnect or a neglected intersection between the question of state Islamophobia and resistance to it, and between abolitionist organising. And so I'm interested in that disconnect. So most of the organising or resistance to state Islamophobia in Britain has unsurprisingly been around Prevent. There have been campaigns in the education sector, for example, organised around slogans such as students not suspects and educators not informants. And most recently, there was a government review of Prevent, which was led by William Shawcross, a known Islamophobe, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. And I'm sure many of you will know this review was subsequently boycotted by hundreds of organisations, including lots of Muslim-led organisations. Building on this, an alternative review was set up entitled the People's Review of Prevent, and the report from that has been recently published and is a really useful resource for anyone interested in the harmful effects of Prevent. That report calls for Prevent to be completely withdrawn, and I think rightly so. And it also really interestingly and importantly emphasises that that Prevent has had a disproportionate impact not only on Muslims, but on children and young people in particular. And I think that's something that is perhaps something that can be mobilized around a little bit more going forward. So as I've been hinting at, I think these two key strands of anti-racist thought and action, police and prison abolition on the one hand, and resistance to state and state-sanctioned Islamophobia on the other, rarely intersect. So the next question really is, why might that be the case? And I think that I think part of the problem is the neglect of and even the existence of Islamophobia on parts of the British left. This was something that I focused on as part of my doctoral research, and I'm sort of continuing to write on it as part of my book. There's a quote here from one of the activists that I spoke to as part of my doctoral research, and that also features in a paper of mine. And this particular activist sums it up really and says, the anti-racism movement hasn't been leading the work around Prevent. Again, this is in the British context. The dissection of it, the analysis of it, all the different elements has been done by Muslims. And I say parts of the British left here, because I want to be careful not to kind of collapse different strands of leftist organising or discourse. Because I think arguably, if anything, the latest wave of abolitionist politics, or the kind of latest abolitionist turn in Britain, has happened really in spite of some of the more reactionary positions of the Labour movement on questions of policing and migration. So we need to be careful there to kind of make distinctions between these different strands of what we broadly call left organising. But nonetheless, I think this fragmentation of the left around some of these key questions of migration, of policing, and of racism, I think that fragmentation might explain or help to explain why some of these silos of resistance and work continue to endure, even where political interests are or seem to be closely aligned. There's also the very basic issue, of the very basic issue of the policing of political dissent, and the ways in which, for Muslims in particular, this has meant that taking a more radical position or critique of Islamophobia, especially doing that publicly, risks you being labelled an extremist. And Suhaima Manzoor Khan has an important account of this in her recent book. And Prevent as a policy has had a real chilling effect. We know it's had a real chilling effect on political dissent in this sense and in this way. And finally, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into this too much today, not in depth, but if anyone's interested, I write a bit about this idea of Muslim leftists being what might be called racialized outsiders in a paper that came out last year. And the idea of racialized outsiders is one that I take from Satnam Virdi. And I use it to sort of explain how between, on the one hand, the failure by the anti-racist left to take Islamophobia seriously, and on the other hand, the liberalism of some Muslim-led activism situates Muslim leftists in a particular relation to anti-racism in Britain, kind of renders them racialized outsiders. So for anyone interested in that, there is a paper that I refer you to, but I think that situating of, or that isolation of Muslim leftists is another reason for the disconnects that I'm trying to speak to today. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. Okay, so why might it be theoretically useful and politically generative then to approach Islamophobia through an abolitionist lens? That's one question. And secondly, what might a burgeoning abolitionist movement gain from better incorporating an analysis of Islamophobia, or a fuller understanding of Islamophobia? Hopefully you're all still with me. So Suhaima Manzoor-Khan's recent book, Tangled in Terror, it's fantastic. It's just being published. I really recommend that people read it. And to my mind, it's kind of one of the rare engagements with Islamophobia through an abolitionist lens, although she's not always explicit in naming it an abolitionist lens, but her approach is very much abolitionist. And I think as part of her argument, and I would agree, an abolitionist perspective offers a kind of defense against what I would call liberal tinkering around issues like prevent. So the attempt to reform and this sort of endless cycle of reform and retribution. So in terms of prevent, an abolitionist perspective makes clear that despite its promise of safety, prevent is actually working exactly as intended. And in this way, and when I say as intended, that's in terms of it's designed to suppress political dissent, it's designed to divide working class communities, and it's designed to justify violent and extractive processes and practices elsewhere. And so, as Manzoor-Khan argues, scrapping prevent or withdrawing prevent is just one step towards police abolition. It's not the end goal. It's one step in a long process of abolition. And finally, an abolitionist critique or an abolitionist perspective also provides a critique of the increasingly popular focus on hate crime. And there's a few scholars who take on an abolitionist critique in their discussion of hate crime. And Julie helpfully pointed to the ways, in her presentation, Julie helpfully pointed to the ways in which hate crime, while important to address, I mean, we might address it in terms of, how it manifests as everyday violence or everyday Islamophobia. But Julie pointed to the ways in which that sort of over-focus on hate crime might detract from the more structural elements of Islamophobia. And I think that's a useful analysis. I think an abolitionist perspective can take us even further in that it focuses critical attention on the violence of the state, and therefore sort of exposes the state's focus on hate crime as what it really is, which I think often is it's an anti-racist alibi for the state. The state can use hate crime to present itself as an anti-racist figure or as an anti-racist force, and at the same time is able to perpetuate some of the worst examples of racist violence. I'm just going to check in on how much time I've got. So I think I will probably skip the next slide, which was just going to be a bit more of an analysis of the limits of framing Islamophobia simply in terms of hate crime. But I think I've probably said enough there. Happy to talk about it a bit more in the discussion. Another brilliant quote by Angela Davis, which kind of sums it up. She says, deep understandings of racist violence arm us against deceptive solutions. When we are told that we simply need better police and better prisons, and I would add to that, better hate crime reporting systems, we counter that with what we really need, we need to reimagine security, which will involve the abolition of policing and imprisonment as we know them. So having said all that, or not having said all that, but in addition or at the same time, I think that a burgeoning abolitionist movement might also benefit from a fuller account of the racialization of Muslims, which we see reproduced through state Islamophobia. And again, Julie offered a really, really helpful overview of what we mean when we talk about racialization. And I would just, reiterate that in terms of understanding racialization as a process that fixes Muslims in place, and it, revealing how so-called races are made and remade. And there are lots of scholars who offer really compelling accounts of the racialization of Muslims in particular. So the question is, why might this be particularly useful for anti-racist work in the current moment? And as I see it, and as lots of activists and scholars have highlighted, contemporary anti-racism in Britain is not immune from what we might call the temptations of more essentialist accounts of race. I'm going to hold off on that a second. So Gargi, Bhattacharya and colleagues argue that this tendency towards a simplified, reductive account of race finds particular resonance online and in online spaces, particularly social media. I'm sure many of us are Twitter users. I'm sure many of us have ambivalent feelings about the usefulness of Twitter for debating the nuances of race and racialization, and that's really what their argument is there. And we saw some of these more reductive accounts of race play out in many online discussions around the recent Black Lives Matter movement as well, as Gargi and colleagues argue. So my main claim here really is that understanding how Muslims are racialized defends, or might help to defend, against these more essentialist accounts of race, and instead moves us towards a connecting of struggles, a connecting of anti-racist struggles in particular. So that question of connecting struggles is exactly what I think is at stake here when we're talking about approaching Islamophobia through an abolitionist lens on the one hand, and on the other, expanding our conception of abolition to include a fuller account of Islamophobia. I think what those two things can do in conjunction with each other is that they can connect anti-racist struggles and potentially help to renew forms of solidarity. The possibilities and indeed limits of connecting anti-racist struggles has been particularly stark in relation to abolitionist politics and the struggle for Palestinian liberation. And I think those who have written on this have really demonstrated the possibilities for connecting global struggles through a commitment to for a commitment to abolition. And Angela Davis has written about it. Annie Olalaku-Turiba has also written a bit about the connections between movements for Palestinian liberation and Black Lives Matter. I'm still thinking through, I suppose, exactly what the relationship is between pro-Palestine activism or struggles for Palestinian liberation, the Black Lives Matter movement, prison abolitionist movement, and state racism in Britain, state Islamophobia in Britain. But to my mind, state Islamophobia in Britain should be a part of that conversation. And that feels like a potentially very generative area for solidarity and for thinking through the connections of differently racialized and differently oppressed groups in Britain and beyond. At the same time, I think we also can't take solidarity for granted, and I always return to David Rodaiga's writing on solidarity, which I think is really important for lending some nuance. And he says, you know, that we've got to contend with, and I quote him here, an erratic pattern of ways in which solidarity actually comes and fails to come into the world. And that's where we've got to keep in mind that building solidarity on the road to abolition is a long, ongoing, and often arduous process. One that we can't take for granted, one that is a process, and that is a work in progress. But I think one that is worth attending to sociologically and politically. I think on that note, I will wrap up. I think I've been speaking for about half an hour, so it'd be a good time to maybe open it up for a bit of a discussion. But I wanted to end on this quote from Zahaima Manzoor Khan's new book, which I've already mentioned. You know, I think it's one of the best arguments for more of an abolitionist approach to Islamophobia that I've read. I'd really encourage everyone to read it. And you know, Zahaima says, the only way Islamophobia can be uprooted is by sowing the seeds for another world altogether. So thank you everyone for listening. I think I'll leave it there. Look forward to any questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. A great deal of food for thought. Can I please ask everybody to get those questions in to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen? And I'd just like to get straight to the heart of the matter to kick things off, which is, how can we do this sort of activism practically? Is it a question of just beginning to connect with different activist groups that are currently focused on particular racisms? Because this does dovetail obviously with Julie's presentation and the discussion. But I know this might sound a bit counterintuitive, but the fact that I'm an academic and an historian to boot, to ask about practicalities, but that is what I find is the most challenging thing. And I just wondered what your thoughts are. I haven't read the book that you were just praising yet, so I don't know if all of the answers to be found there. But in terms of practical steps, what do you think needs to be done?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, it's the question really, in terms of how we move forward. I mean, I think so much of the work is already being done. So much of the work is already being done in terms of community organizing through an abolitionist approach. At the same time, the work is being done to challenge structural Islamophobia, to challenge state Islamophobia. And I think it's just about connecting those small local instances of resistance, just connecting them up better. And I think sometimes you need a conceptual framework in order to do that. And I think police abolition kind of offers that conceptual framework to make the connections between different forms of organizing that are already taking place. There's loads of stuff going on. I'm really happy to, talk about some examples from Manchester in terms of, for example, the Northern Police Monitoring Project are doing loads of organizing. They had a really successful campaign in terms of preventing the addition of extra police in schools in Greater Manchester. So there was a proposal to basically increase the number of police officers stationed in schools, which for obvious reasons is problematic in terms of, police racism, in terms of police misogyny, the question of, do we want police officers in our schools, in our educational spaces? And that was a really successful campaign and actually halted that proposal by by Manchester City Council. And actually there's some really obvious connections there with Prevent and the introduction of forms of surveillance and forms of securitization into educational spaces. So for me, there are lots of ways that these struggles can be connected. The work is already being done in lots of places. So it's just about, I think, bringing communities together. It's been really hard during COVID to do that. I think often you need people in the same room, physically in the same room. Zoom just doesn't cut the mustard, in my opinion, when it comes to anti-racist organising. But I think slowly we're starting to be able to get people in the same room with each other and have those conversations. So I don't know if that quite answers your question.
It does, Dr. Harris, thank you. I'd just like to go a little bit further on that particular example that you raised, and because you said it was successful, and you mentioned about the council. So was it successful because there was petitioning of councillors, or was it because there were councillors involved in the campaign? How did it actually work?
It was a combination of tactics. So from my understanding, it was a combination of working with trade unions, including the teachers' unions, getting them to pass motions of resistance to that policy. There was also a petition that was signed by lots and lots of people that got submitted to the council. There was also a report that academics were involved in writing, which pulled together experiences and opinions of people in the community in terms of what they thought about police in schools. So it was a combination of different tactics. And I mean, it's an ongoing battle, but it's by no means finished. The campaign is ongoing. And in Greater Manchester in particular, we're up against some real challenges. They've just, for example, raised council tax across the region to fund more police officers, despite a public survey suggesting that only 23% of people agreed with that. So that there are ongoing challenges, but I think that was that prevention of increasing police in schools was a small win that we should celebrate, especially as Greater Manchester Police are still in special measures and still, I won't go into what I think of Greater Manchester Police or the kind of issues with them, ongoing issues with them, but I think that was a win for anti-racists.
Thank you very much. It's very striking to me that this is a very substantially different approach to what Julie was outlining with the ENAR, which is very much looking to affect high-level state policy making mechanisms. However, both of you are talking about tackling structural Islamophobia. And I just wondered if you could comment on the contrast between the two and how, because the thing is that obviously, and I don't want to speak for Julie, I'm hoping that Julie could come in on this in a moment, but the ENAR itself is made up of a huge number of grassroots organizations doing this kind of work. However, the people at the center of the network are trying to tackle structural racisms and particularly Islamophobia through developing relationships, I suppose, is the key difference with policymakers. And whereas what that example you're describing is very much to do with public campaigning and public pressure, which is rather different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a distinction there, an important distinction there, and that's probably about how, as anti-racists, we approach the state. It's about where we think the future of anti-racist movements is, whether it's working within the state to, you know, reform institutions, or whether we think actually working outside of the state, often pressuring the state from the outside, and moving potentially away from party politics. You know, that's another route. And my view is that actually some of the most successful anti-racist mobilizations of the last couple of years have worked outside of the state, and they've worked or continue to work as grassroots movements, putting pressure on the state and on institutions from the outside. So whether that's Black Lives Matter, whether that's the Kill the Bill movement in the UK, which is ongoing, you know, these have mobilized huge amounts of people, and to me it's really felt like an exciting time, like a resurgence of anti-racism in Britain that we've not really seen since the 70s and 80s potentially. And I think that is because people are coming together in a much more grassroots way from the bottom up, and I think for me that's the future of anti-racist work and change. But I appreciate there are different approaches to that, and I think there's also space for, you know, hybrid approaches and a diversity of tactics as anti-racist campaigners. I think one more thing I'd like to say on that is, and I was thinking this as Julie was presenting, I wonder to what extent the concepts of institutional and structural racism can kind of be absorbed or appropriated by states and by nation states in a way that kind of defangs them is the only phrase I can think to use, in a way that sort of takes the radical potential out of those concepts. I'm interested in that, and if that's the case, then do we need to start talking about state racism in addition to, or even instead of, institutional and structural racism? I think that's an interesting conversation that we could have as people committed to anti-racism.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Julie, could I ask you just to come in on this issue of about this question of how effective activism can operate either outside of the state or in dialogue with states or within supra-state organizations?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is really an amazing discussion. I mean, this is definitely a reflection that we have also at the core of our movement, especially after the impact of the protests in 2020. I mean, many things wouldn't have happened without the street protests, the grassroots mobilization. Of course, many of our members actually were involved. We have a diversity of members actually in our movement, and they are all looking for different things also in our movement. Some of them are more looking for connection, for actually building this movement. Others are more looking for also for increasing the relationship with policymakers, also increasing their influence on policies and legislation. Not all of them are doing this kind of advocacy as we are doing at the Secretariat. And actually at the Secretariat, we are not only doing this kind of advocacy. So we have also colleagues working much more on network mobilization, on research, etc. And we are also having a lot of reflection about to what extent we should put, to review also how we put energies on the different elements of our work. And I really hear the different strategies and the impact of grassroots mobilization. This is really something that we have seen, as I said. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, how I also see the anti-racism movement, I still believe that we need the different strategies, especially because we are still operating in a specific system and structure. So we also need to ensure that we have still a seat at the table in these current structures, because still we can mitigate some impact of these current structures that are far from, of course, being perfect, and that we also need to change like profoundly. So this is more our approach, that yes, we need to strengthen our movement, to build the power of our movement, because that's the way we change things. But at the same time, we need to keep a door open, because some of the technical solutions, some of the policies that we can propose can help going towards more radical changes. At least that's what we think. And the paradox that you are mentioning on how do we advocate for the recognition of institutional racism towards institution, I mean, that's a whole paradox. At the same time, I think that's maybe a less radical way of trying to like introduce this idea, to kind of have reparations from member states, have recognitions, have more oversight on police forces, on security forces, etc. So for us, this is a way to also to try, again, to mitigate all these impacts. But I definitely agree. I mean, I truly believe that we need both strategies with a much more focus on building the power of a movement. And when I was mentioning the issue of narrative, I think we will not be able to change the narrative if our movement at grassroots level is not strong enough.
Thank you very much. This is all very helpful. And I would like to now invite, we've got several people who've asked questions in the Q&A box, and I'd just like to invite them to pose the questions themselves. First of all, the co-director with me of the ICR, Dr. Jenny Barrett. Hello, Dr. Barrett, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Hey, sorry about the echo. I'm actually in my kitchen right now. So yeah, the question that I've got is that a lot of us work on the university campus, and every now and then we'll have people saying, you know, what can we do about anti-racism? Some will be staff and some will be students. There's a multicultural society as part of the Students' Union already, and they work very hard and very successfully to help people from all sorts of different backgrounds to feel part of a cohort, part of a community. For staff, that's not always quite so easy. We don't have those sorts of societies for staff. What do you think about us finding solidarity somehow on the campus?
Hi, Jenny. Thank you for that question. It's a really important one. Solidarity on campus, especially in terms of what staff can do and how staff can connect with students. That's how I understand your question. Hopefully that's the right interpretation.
Yeah, that's good.
So I think the problem that we're up against as anti-racists, in my view, working on campuses, is that anti-racism is very easily taken up by universities as huge neoliberal institutions, and used in ways that don't necessarily move things forward or move things forward in the direction that we want them to. So I think it's about choosing carefully where we put our energy on campus. You know, I think that there's lots of things that we can be doing. Obviously, something that is very that's talked about a lot at the moment is this idea of decolonizing the curriculum as a kind of anti-racist practice. I think that's really important. I think in terms of, you know, our teaching, that's something that we can be working on. I also think that we can go further than that, though, when we talk about decolonizing things on campus or decolonizing the university, and start to think about, well, what are the material ties that the university has to other institutions, organizations, companies that actually perpetuate racism in maybe kind of insidious ways. They're not always obvious, but you know, I'm talking about the university that I work for having ties to arms companies, you know, and if we're serious about anti-racism, then that's the kind of thing we should be talking about, I think. In terms of staff-student solidarity, I'm, you know, I mean, where to start? Again, I'm going back to the example of the University of Manchester, but there's a student group that popped up called Cops Off Campus after students were harassed on campus by police officers during COVID-19. People might remember that students were essentially locked into their halls of residence during lockdown and faced all sorts of forms of harassment. And this student group emerged in response to that, calling themselves Cops Off Campus. Now, I think that's like a really, you know, that's the sort of thing that as staff we should be supporting students with and getting behind, especially in terms of how the encroachment of policing and private security onto campus affects and impacts on our students who are from racially minoritized backgrounds. So there are a couple of examples of where I see, you know, opportunities for really substantial anti-racist work that can happen on campuses that kind of go beyond the diversity paradigm that it kind of is often foregrounded in these discussions of anti-racism on campus.
That's fantastic, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, now we'll move to one of the PhD student members of the centre, Eleanor Gigino. Eleanor, I'm just going to unmute you, bear with me. There we go. Perhaps.
Eleanor?
No, I don't think we're hearing Eleanor. Well, I will move to her questions. There were a couple of things here. Eleanor asked, surely with racism, there is a need to tackle the fear factor. People are afraid for their safety, so make rash decisions. How can we combat this?
Okay, I'm interested to know, I'd be interested to clarify with that question from Eleanor, who they mean when they say people are afraid for their safety. Are we talking about those who...
Can you hear me now?
Hi,
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Sorry. Oh, right, great. No, I was just sort of thinking about kind of how in the past the IRA and the sort of Britain and things like that, how that was perceived, and there's a big fear factor, and it kind of created this big fear-mongering sort of thing. And I think sort of going back to the previous talk about how in France they have had, I think, kind of the largest volume, I think I just did a quick search, of terrorist attacks in the past 20 or I think from since 1970, so maybe 40, 50 years. So I just sort of thought, what are the ways to kind of make people less afraid and have kind of more relationships with people from, especially if we're now focusing more on Islamophobia, sort of building up networks between people so there's less of this fear and less of this kind of stereotyping of a whole religious or national group, and have less of this kind of fear and sort of prevent this profiling of people that you think are being radicalized. I think that's the sort of issue, the deeper psychological or philosophical thing that needs to be tackled.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for that, Eleanor. I'd be interested to hear Julie's take on this. My view is that it's difficult because I think that if we centre the question of fear too much in our understandings of Islamophobia, then that has particular implications for how we respond. I think that there's basically, I think you're right, Eleanor, to identify that fear is a symptom of wider processes and structures, whether that is, you know, the machinations of counter-terror and the counter-terror regime, which tell us to be fearful and tell us to spy on our colleagues and our students and our neighbours, whether that is the media and the demonization of Muslims in the media that tell us that, you know, that Britain's being, that there's, you know, internal suspects that we need to be afraid of, or that we're being, you know, flooded by migrants, whatever else. I think it's really important to identify that fear that you're talking about is a symptom of those larger problems. And until we deal with those larger problems, then it's very difficult to contend with what I see as the symptoms of those things. Having said that, I think, you know, there's lots of ways in which people interact with difference in their everyday lives, especially in you know, multicultural urban conurbations like Manchester, where I live, or like London or wherever else. And that, I think that can be a source of solidarity. I think that can be a source of sort of everyday resistance to some of those narratives that tell us to be afraid. So yeah, so if, to answer your question, how do we reduce that fear? I would still go back to that question of like, what is the source of that fear? And also maybe what does it do to our conversations when we center the fear of those who are being Islamophobic rather than the fear of those who are subject to Islamophobia, which actually gets talked about less somehow in these discussions. So that's my take, but I'd be interested to know what Julie thinks.
Should I jump in?
Yeah, please.
I don't have voice anymore, but yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, in our report on counterterrorism, we found that between 2006 and 2019, ISIS Al-Qaeda inspired terrorism amount to 0.009% of European Muslims. It's the figure. It doesn't mean, I mean, it doesn't want, I don't want to justify anything, but I just want to show that, or I think the whole narrative around these attacks, not of course to how can I say, like, to deny them or to deny the impact and the horrible violence that have been produced, but the whole framework around also the coverage of these attacks and the stigmatization and the way it has been also yeah, the whole narrative around that are already problematic. I think it happened already in a context where minorities are already being constructed as a problem. So I would just, yeah, support what you were saying, because I think we really need to really look at that, like what is the impact of what is the minority majority issue in our society, what it doesn't imply. Why is it that when one person from a minority does something that it's having an impact on the whole community? I mean, we also need to question all of that. and deconstruct all of that. And I was mentioning about the importance to connect oppressions, to have an intersectional approach. Like, we all need to question like broader inequalities, like you know, economic inequalities. What are the violence also in other fields as well? And yeah, I mean, this is really a broader approach to the issue, I would say. As you were saying, this is really just a symptom.
Thank you very much. I would just add that this event is being co-organized by Monitor Racism magazine, and the editor of Monitor Racism magazine, Monica Gonzalez Correa. The whole thrust of that project is to share the insights of scholarship into wider discussions and wider debate, and to unlock the findings of all of this research that otherwise can end up basically within conversations between a few scholars. And I thought that was important for me to highlight this, because the issue of challenging narratives, which Julie talked about, is extremely difficult, but even more so if the experts who have been so maligned themselves in public discussions internationally, if all of the crucial findings of their research is not being broadly communicated, then I think that's got to be one of the key strategies for effectively undermining false narratives that undergird structural racisms in general. Because, of course, if grassroots campaigning is key, then surely the more people we can mobilize and engage to become involved in grassroots campaigning, the more effective it can be. And that has to come through proactively, visibly, and extensively challenging the foundational elements of racisms across the board. And this is one of the aspects of Monitor Racism that I find particularly exciting. I'm going to move on now into the depths of history for our next question from Henry Holborn. Henry, I'm going to invite you to speak, please. Over to you, Henry.
Hi, yeah, great, thanks very much. Just a question for Scarlett. I think a lot of your research has a lot of interesting parallels with the early 20th century in Britain and the policing of racialized others, particularly the Aliens Restrictions Act. And relevant to Manchester is the Greater Manchester Police Museum has the alien registers of the Salford Police, which kind of gives a really interesting insight into the policing of racialized others. So I just thought, what are your kind of understandings of other historical kind of backgrounds and roots to this research? Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. And a really good and challenging question as well for me as a sociologist who is often, you know, there's a critique of sociology that it is mired in presentism and doesn't engage with history enough. And I'm sure that I am sometimes guilty of that as well. So a really important question about historical background. Thank you. There's loads of really interesting histories in Manchester. I'd be interested to see that register that you mentioned in the police museum. I mean, there's also, I guess, thinking more broadly than Manchester, some of the histories that I really draw on in my research are the histories of anti-racism in Britain that are extremely rich, and I would say, you know, almost unprecedented in terms of their formations and their mobilizations, especially in the kind of late 70s and into the 1980s. And we see some really interesting examples of, I think, the connections between struggles that existed then in the 70s and 80s at the height of kind of anti-racism. I think we saw a lot of connections between struggles then that we don't see so much anymore. So I think, for example, and there's loads of examples, but one example is the Asian youth movement, who had chapters all over the UK and who were involved in anti-deportation campaigns. They were involved in, you know, they were explicitly anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist. They were involved in, you know, local defense campaigns against racist violence, anti-fascism. So, but it was led by, you know, young South Asian people. And that was a really kind of exceptional example, I think, of forms of solidarity in Britain that I think we can draw on in thinking about what's going on today in terms of anti-racism, but also where we might want to go, or what we might want to reconnect with. And I think there's a book coming out soon, written by Ilyas Nagdi and a colleague whose name unfortunately escapes me right now, which is about reconnecting with some of those histories of anti-racism in Britain in our current anti-racist practice. So there's probably other people who are better placed to talk about those things than me. But that's where I go, that's where I tend to go to when I'm thinking a bit more historically. But you're absolutely right to kind of push us to think more historically. I think that's really important. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Thank you, Henry. We also have an open question that connects with what we were discussing a moment ago, which is follow-up musing, and this has been put anonymously. The IRA and UDA were both massive terrorist groups active in the UK. There's now much less fear of Irish Catholics, Protestants. How can people learn to be less fearful towards practitioners of Islam? Evidently, this is connected with the issue that we ended up discussing already, but I think it's important to make sure that all questions and comments are aired. If the person who posed that question would like to speak to it, please do identify yourself in the chat and I can unmute you. Otherwise, I'd just like to make a particular comment, which is a bit of an elephant in the room when we're talking about effective anti-racism campaigning and building bridges, which is our first session that we had last week in this series, which was on anti-Semitism. And last week's session was actually all about building bridges within the Jewish community, because there are very different approaches to dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism within higher education and elsewhere. There are all sorts of community groups and student groups who are against anti-Semitism, who center around a fixed definition of anti-Semitism by an international group of states, which many people follow and agree with, and then many scholars within Jewish studies, scholars of anti-Semitism, find it hugely problematic. And so our session last week was to talk about how to build bridges between groups where it seems incredibly challenging. So if somebody is an historian of anti-Semitism like myself, and I find this particular definition, or indeed any definition of anti-Semitism, to be problematic. And the reason why it's problematic is because of its connections specifically to the politics of Israel-Palestine. connects with what Dr. Harris was talking about at the conclusion of her talk. But we had a very sort of attempted a practical discussion last week between the Union of Jewish Students and other perspectives of how to bridge gaps. And the reason why I was thinking of that is, first of all, because one of the aims of Monitor Racism magazine and also the Centre is to talk about all racisms and to study them in relation to each other. But the other point that occurred to me is that if we think of the biggest campaigning against racism within the European Union and the UK over the last 20 years has been the campaign against anti-Semitism, which has become embedded within legislations within member states of the EU, within the UK, and all sorts of other things that have been done. But the fact remains that even though there is a great deal of public marking of, for example, the Holocaust and Holocaust memorialization, the main issue, I think, over the last century at the heart of anti-Semitism, which is the belief in a Jewish world conspiracy, if anything, the belief in that amongst publics around the world has grown. It's not diminished in any way. And that is the racism that has been proactively campaigned against internationally, supranationally, and by governments. Now, this is a common, but I think it's something for us to think about. Surely a litmus test for building bridges in fighting against racism is, for example, those who campaign against Islamophobia and those who campaign against anti-Semitism. But I would just sidestep that issue and just ask, what does that example tell us about how to fight effectively against racism? If so much energy has been put into fighting against anti-Semitism, and yet this fundamental aspect of anti-Semitism is alive and kicking, probably flourishing in the open more than it has for a long time, the idea of a Jewish world conspiracy, what does that tell us about effective or ineffective anti-racism activity?
Yeah, thank you, James. That's a really interesting and important intervention, I think. And thank you for reminding us of the ongoing issue of anti-Semitism in Britain and indeed across the world. There's a lot to say, I think, on this question, and really we need like another seminar to address this. And I'm really interested to watch back the seminar on anti-Semitism that took place as part of this series. I was unfortunately not able to make it. So I'm interested to hear the different perspectives there. For what it's worth, my sense in terms of, why might it be that that conspiracy theories concerning Jewish people, concerning the idea of, a Jewish world conspiracy, why are they flourishing at the same time as anti-Semitism has been perhaps the biggest preoccupation for governments who are sort of interested in challenging racism, right? I think that's kind of what you were suggesting. How has that happened? I think one response to that would be to say that actually a lot of these anti-racist responses to these different forms of racism have been quite isolated and fragmented, and there hasn't been the connecting up of dots between how racisms function and how in relation to differently racialized people across the world. And I think what I'm trying to get onto here is there's a really, I think, important paper that Nasser Mir wrote on understanding the racialization of Jewish people and the racialization of Muslims alongside each other. And I think connecting those forms of racialization can tell us lots, actually, and might be really useful for different forms of anti-racism. And I think that probably a lot of work around anti-Semitism has happened in sort of in silos, has lacked that connection with other movements, with other understandings of racism. And race is a kind of force which adapts in different situations and at different historical moments. And I think that's where sociologists come in useful, actually, in terms of thinking through what do we mean by race and what do we mean by racism, and how can that impact our approach to tackling these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Julie, could you comment on this as well, please? On this issue, I mean, you must see a great deal of this in Brussels, the preoccupation by states and institutions to fight anti-Semitism, and yet, to my mind, as a scholar of anti-Semitism, an historian of anti-Semitism, as well as Islamophobia, it does strike me that it's not been very successful.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Sahas just mentioned. I think there has been indeed a siloed approach to the forms of racism, especially on different forms, but it's true that anti-Semitism has been one of the first campaign around recognizing forms of racism because also of what happened in Europe. And this compartmentalization also has led to a kind of hierarchy also and competition between groups, depending on the resources they were having to advocate, to mobilize, etc. And this has not been successful because, as I was mentioning, first you totally depoliticize also what is racism. You also disconnect from the root causes of inequalities, and you make it a kind of exception. And unfortunately, we still see that when it comes to advocacy and mobilization at EU level, and we still see that also at national level. There are also I don't want to judge, but there are also like very superficial ways to advocate for the recognition of racism. And for example, just ensuring that the name of the form of racism is there is enough, or just stopping at the remembrance step and not going further in terms of structural policies, and we have seen that a lot. And for example, at the EU level, so you have the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, but I've not mentioned that there is also the Roma framework, which is requiring member states to have national Roma strategies to fight against anti-Gypsyism. And now, just after the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, there has been the adoption of also a framework for national strategy against anti-Semitism. And although, when actually the EU Action Plan could have been an opportunity to actually reconnect and advocate in a united front, we see that there has been already different strategies for advocacy. We understand, I totally understand. I have been in different coalitions supporting different groups. I totally understand from where it comes from, the fear of invisibilization, the fear of not also understanding the complexities of histories of oppressions, etc. But in my work, I really try now to really encourage to reconnect and support different groups. I think it's not conducive to do advocacy this way in a siloed approach, because it's not questioning the structural issues. So it will not lead very far. And as I said, it's really at a very superficial level. And in the end, it's more about power than anything. It's kind of reproducing a power hierarchy. And it's not leading to success. So I think that's also maybe one of the reasons why anti-Semitism has not been addressed meaningfully.
Thank you very much. I would add that Monitor Racism magazine was launched at the UK Houses of Parliament several years ago. And the theme of the launch was on the relationship between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. For those of you not aware of the magazine, I've just put the address in the chat. And in fact, through its podcast channel is a recording from that particular launch. But the reason why I wanted to mention it is that it was a very successful event that did bring together all sorts of different community groups who participated within that discussion, as much as there were people in the room who were from the House of Lords or from the House of Commons. And also I think it's significant that once you start to discuss racisms together, and to do that in collaboration, in partnership with a range of groups from racialized communities and people who work on these racisms, the response seems to me to always be that people suggesting, well, that once they see it, it seems such an obvious thing to be doing and to be celebrated, even by people who you wouldn't expect to hear celebrating such a collaboration. So I do agree with everybody that this has got to be a way forward, and I would like to congratulate Monitor Racism editor for all of the work that's been done there, whether it's on Romophobia or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. And I hope that as the world can get beyond the pandemic, that there can be much more of that kind of activism that we saw with the launching of the magazine in the pre-COVID era. It now falls to me to thank both of our speakers, Julie Pascoe and Dr. Harris, for having contributed, to everybody for coming along and for your questions and your comments. I'm pleased to say that we will be uploading this session, which I think has brought up a lot of really important themes and food for thought for the future. And it's going to be on the Monitor Racism YouTube channel for all to see and for all to listen to. So thank you so much for taking the time to attend, and most of all to our speakers for taking the time to share their expertise with us. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you.